Welcome to James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Before we dive in, we're going to look back to 2 weeks ago. We're going to do our challenge follow-up. So 2 weeks ago, we challenged you to pick an area of your speech that you believe that the Holy Spirit is convicting you about, and then decide on some type of action to implement instead. And so our question is, how did that go? I will confess that I wrote something very specific down. And I'm not completely sure what it was, because the Holy Spirit convicted me of something different while I was driving in the car. Because it turns out that as I was driving in the car, people did things that were silly, and I would say, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing, you idiot?" And then I was like,
"Is that all?"
So I then would pray for the person and apologize for calling them an idiot or a moron or whatever else happened to come out of my mouth, or that I thought in my head. So that was me. So I'm going to encourage you to go ahead, turn to somebody close to you, and take a couple minutes. Share, hey, did I do it? Did I not? How's the speech going? Go. Now that we've spent a little bit of time looking back, thinking through how do we seek to apply last 2 weeks ago's lesson, let's start to move forward to James 3, 13 through 18. In those same groups, go ahead and you can turn to page 57 if you have your workbook, and read or reread through the passage. And then what we would love for you to talk about in your pairs is, what is the main idea of this section? And why do you think that that's the main idea of the section? What is the main thing that James is trying to communicate in these verses? Go ahead, take a couple minutes, go. So, heard lots of good thoughts as I was walking around, some good observations. We're really going to be diving into the meat of the text once again. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are too. But before we dive into the meat of the text, what do we have to look at?
Context.
For some reason, every time I try to hit through the context slide, I miss the button. Slightly awkward. That's fine. So last week, we took a look at James 3, 1 through 12. We talked about how all believers, to some degree or another, struggle with speech control. And so James cautioned his readers not to strive for that platform of being a teacher necessarily, not to get all gung-ho about it, because teachers are going to be judged more harshly because of how they're laying God's word out there, saying, hey, live this way. So he said, hey, maybe take a chill pill, back off of that goal a little bit. And we talked about, hey, if our goal is to be mature, consistent followers of Christ, what should we be doing? We should be seeking to control what we say, both to avoid being hypocritical, because we want to be consistent with our nature as born-again believers, people who follow God, but also so that we avoid all of those tragic consequences that we talked about in 2 weeks ago's lesson. So, as we start to move forward into this next section, the transition is, once again, it's a little bit rough, but there is a cohesive line of thought here. Back at the beginning, we started off by talking about how faith is lived out by what we do. In chapter 2, we were talking about, hey, it's not just something where you say, you, go, be warm and fed, and that's it. That's not the type of faith that pleases God. Faith that pleases God is the faith that gets on your feet and goes and makes that person a meal and brings them into your home. That's a faith that God is pleased with. So we started off thinking about our hands. Next, we talked about faith that's lived out in what we say. And so now we're sort of going inward and saying the place where this whole process starts is inside of us. We can't get to all of those exteriors until we begin with the heart, what's going on inside us. So altogether, we're continuing along James's sort of general thesis that religion that honors God and religion that God values is faith that produces righteousness. And it's not just something that lives in your head, but it's lived out in the world. So let's dive in. We're going to start off James 3:13. Let's read it and then we'll take a look. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Now, very first thing that we see is these two ideas of wisdom and understanding. Now, we've already talked about the idea of wisdom back in earlier sections. Just to recap, wisdom is that idea of knowledge applied, living skillfully in accordance with God's word and his character. So that's wisdom on the one hand, and on the other hand is this understanding, which is more of the abstract thing. You have a knowledge about something, you have sort of head skills or knowledge and general know-how. So we have these two aspects. James is starting off with this rhetorical question. Hey, who actually comprehends what is good, what God values, and how to live in accordance with what God values? In other words, who is truly wise? Fortunately, he doesn't leave us hanging for a super long time. He answers right away. We can pick out those people who are wise by how they live, by their behavior. He talks about this idea of good conduct. And this phrase, good conduct, isn't just a sort of once-off, you have a good deed here and a good deed there, but it's a God-honoring lifestyle. And so just as people who possess mature faith show it by works and love, people who possess God-fearing wisdom also show it by their works. And notice that this is in contrast with the believers in the last section. Believers who are hypocritical, who are poisonous, and destructive are not going to be having this type of wisdom. They're living in contrary to this wisdom. And so the works that James describes are to be shown, to be exhibited in meekness. Now, meekness is just basically a word that means gentleness. So you're not being arrogant about it. You're not being all up in people's faces. But you're showing your works in gentleness, in accordance with the same line of wisdom of living according to what God values. Now, James is about to give us a fantastic contrast. And is it a contrast or is it a contrast? It's a contrast. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. So the very first word that we have showing up here is jealousy, zelos. The word is translated as jealousy, but the better English word to translate this is actually envy. We today frequently use these words interchangeably. We've probably talked about these terms before. But these words do have different meanings. Jealousy is whenever you want to keep something all for yourself. So in human terms, you have, oh, well, she's a jealous girlfriend. She wants to keep her boyfriend all to herself. She doesn't want to, share him with his friends or with his family. She just wants to keep him all to herself. Now, we can use the term jealousy in a positive manner. Our God is a jealous God. Rightly so. He wants our affection. He wants our loyalty to be devoted solely and entirely to him, not to any false gods. And again, rightly so, because he is the one true living God. So jealousy can be a good thing. Envy cannot. Envy is wanting what somebody else has for yourself. Envy always is accompanied by and leads to bitterness. So it's not just walking down the street and saying, oh, that's such a lovely garden. Wow. Oh, I think I'm going to go home and spend a little bit more time in my garden because I'd like to emulate that person's garden. No. This is I wish that I had a garden like that. I should have a garden like that. It isn't fair that they have a garden like that and I don't. You have that seething resentment in your soul. So that's the difference, right? It's not just you want something that somebody else has, but it's that bitterness that accompanies it that really shows you that what you're feeling is in fact envy. Now, that's only the first part of what James is saying may be inside. Next, we have selfish ambition, Arathea. Now, this phrase has an interesting origin. It means to spin for hire. Now, this is not talking about a general capitalistic spirit where you're like, hey, I'm going to go and work and then make a profit and yay, good things. This is like the Ebenezer Scrooge, where you're calculating, how is this going to benefit me? Weighing every opportunity. And if it doesn't benefit you, not going to go for that. Twisting everything so that it's for your own personal gain. And so these two things we're seeing, if we don't have God's wisdom, these may be what are inside of us. Now, we have to pause for a moment and talk about a lovely figure of speech here. Heart is a metonymy. This is a substitution of a concrete for an abstract. He's not talking about the literal heart that is beating within our chests, but it is instead the idea of our emotions, or even beyond our emotions, because that's what we frequently use heart for today. But in this day and age, it was more the center of will, who you are, the essence of you, where you're making your decisions. James is describing somebody who is being ruled by not wisdom, but a self-centered, cutthroat competitiveness. And this, though it is a type of worldly wisdom, is not God's wisdom. Now, I did look up this Greek word, and I listened to it.
Say it.
Several times, and I cannot say it. I tried, and there are too many syllables, and their accents are in weird places. But I wanted to show it to you because it's a really fun word. So now you can go home and look this up on Blue Letter Bible and try it yourself. But, so the word boast is again a different one than the one that we've seen twice previously. We encountered two prior words that were translated as boast, but that meant something different. Again, this is the advantage of going back to the Greek a little bit, going back to original languages, because we see boast, 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 but in Greek there are very different words with very different meanings. Now, the boast that's used here is a little bit more similar to what and how we would use the word boast today. It has the idea of exalting self, but also the idea of pushing other people down. So what James is exhorting his fellow believers to do is, hey, if you have this selfish ambition and this envy and bitterness in your heart, then don't go strutting around telling people that, I'm really wise. I'm really following God. I've got my heart in the right place, and you know what? I think that God's pretty pleased with me. He's saying, hey, this flatly contradicts reality and betrays a much more sinister truth. Now, James has just finished emphasizing the importance of consistency in the prior section, especially verses 9 through 12. If our words and attitudes betray that we're indulging in a foolish heart, we really ought to take a chill pill and glorying in ourselves over other believers. We're not as much the impressive, honorable figures as we may imagine ourselves to be. Instead, we've been deceived by worldly wisdom. Now, you may say, okay, well, I don't think that really characterizes me. I don't really identify with that. That seems like a little bit too much. But let's take a closer look at this worldly wisdom. He characterizes this wisdom in a few different ways here. And I would like to draw your attention to my highly technical term right here on the screen for what kind of wisdom is this. Bad wisdom. It's very technical. I appreciate your getting on board with these technical definitions. So, first of all, he talks about how this wisdom is not from above. Now, this harks back to James 1:17, in which James credits every good and perfect gift as being from the Father, coming down from heaven, the Father of lights. And so, this wisdom is not from God in heaven. Pretty straightforward. Now, the next two words, earthly and unspiritual, essentially they're very similar in meaning. You can think about earthly as originating from the earth, being very, it's almost the same as not from God, but it's earthly based. Unspiritual. So if God is spirit and we're thinking about the real nature of things, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's, hey, what can I feel? What can I touch? The materialistic side of things. It's what's here, what's now, what's right in front of me. And if we're progressing downward from not great to worse, demonic. Now, if you remember back to the prior section, we said, hey, all the origin for all the terrible things that emanate from our bad use of our speech, that origin's hell. This is too. The wisdom that is not from God is rooted in hell. And so an example of such wisdom is pretty obvious today everywhere online, but especially in wake of the abortion case that is now sitting before the Supreme Court. It's been argued, and all of the abortion proponents have come out in the different social media sites that I'm on and arguing fiercely for abortion. I'm not going to put up screenshots of anything that they say because it's pretty hard to take. But it's almost exactly a picture of such wisdom. Earthly. Based on what's going on here and now. What's in it for me right now? What can I feel? What can I touch? What's in it for me? It's unspiritual. Denies the reality of who's involved, what's really going on in an abortion, how it affects each person. It's demonic. They advocate for murder with a straight face, and they believe that it's wise. They believe it's good, and they are deceived. It's straight from the pit of hell, but they don't know it. According to the world system, what do you do to get ahead?
Live for yourself.
You live for yourself. You do what you need to. You tell lies about other people. And in the world system, does it work? Sometimes. Sometimes it does. That's how the world says, this is how you get ahead. You don't care about other people. If it takes killing somebody else to get what you want so that you're comfortable, so that you get what you need to out of life, then you do it. It's all about you.
And so if you're looking back at what you said, wisdom is knowledge applied.
Right.
They're using their earthly knowledge and applying it to
Right.
an earthly system. So it's quote unquote wisdom, but it's not from God.
Correct. Which means that it's not
Real.
true wisdom. In the end,
Yeah.
they're going to find out that they have been deceived.
As in wise in their own eyes.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. That's where we do have to get down to the definitions and say, okay, well, they believe that what they're doing is wise, and to them it is a type of skillful living because they're navigating the systems that have been put up in place. But the system is corrupt. It is earthly, and it leads to death, and they don't know it.
Or they don't care.
I think that there are few people, I hope that there are few people who truly perceive the full extent of the damage that they do in their lives and in the lives of others and really hardcore buckle down. There are those people out there. There are. And I think that, unfortunately, they're probably increasing just as our culture becomes more and more hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. But I think, and I pray, that many people are deceived and that they can be won over by the truth. So, worldly wisdom is terrible, it's abominable, and it has horrific consequences. And the abortion narrative is just one example of that. There are many. Now, in contrast to verse 13, which states that the consequence of possessing and applying wisdom is a lifestyle of humble display of good works. Verse 16 gives the consequences of a backbiting, competitive, manipulative, self-centered worldly wisdom. First we have, again, disorder. Now remember, he's writing specifically to who? A church congregation that's been scattered. So think about this in the context of a church. Perhaps you can imagine or even recall a situation where the characteristics of bitter envy and selfish ambition have caused division within a church gathering. It happens. Even within God's people, which is why James is writing to them. Disintegrating into chaos. And the other is every vile practice. Now, James doesn't limit the possible wickedness that could arise from this bitter envy and selfish ambition. And we shouldn't either. I think that it can be easy to forget how serious these sins are, and to forget even that they're sins. You're like, oh, well, I had that little twinge, but it's whatever, it's no big deal, I'm just going to ignore it. But it corrodes our soul, and it does lead to disorder in every vile practice. It's just like whenever we talked about how sin gives birth eventually to death, we just don't see it right away. And so these things are serious. James is telling them, hey, this isn't just like an immature Christian not living very well. These are serious things. It's abominable and it's dangerous to live according to worldly wisdom. Now, these things, disorder in these vile practices, are the harvest of worldly wisdom. This is about to be contrasted in the next section with the harvest from God's wisdom. Now, but before we get there, I do want to point out that we have a little bit of chiastic structure here. James starts out by talking about God's wisdom, and then he slides into a little mini section on worldly wisdom, and then he goes back and talks again about God's wisdom. And again, that's something that we don't always see in English literature because we don't write like that in that circular fashion, but that's how James is going in. Now, James, again, is launching into a little mini exposition into the opposite of the consequence of worldly wisdom, returning to and expanding upon God's wisdom. So let's take a look. We're going to read the whole thing and then dive in. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So we're going to go through the whole list, dive into each one. We're going to go deep. What does wisdom from God look like when it's impacting believers' souls, being embedded in our minds, and being applied in our lives? Now, this first word, hagnos, you may have heard one of the pastors use before. They used it a few times. It means without moral defect or blemish, basically being separate from the world's values. Now notice, it needs to be first, because if we're not separate from the world's values, if we're stained by moral defects, our wisdom is gonna be the worldly kind, not the godly one. Now, inevitably, there will be some objection somewhere, hypothetically, that says, well, does this mean that we should never engage with the world? Should we just go live out in a cave somewhere? And this objection, though it is raised from time to time in different settings, is a little bit of a red herring. It's just sort of thrown up because none of us really believe that we ought to be living in a cave. We're all here. And so we know that we have to be in the world, but not of the world. So we don't want to distract from the real question, which is, how do we truly live separate from the world's values? It's all too easy to be complacent, to think, well, it's not that bad. Those Christians over there do it. They let their kids do X, Y, Z, or watch whatever over here. It's hard. We're lazy sometimes. We're comfortable. And it would be very uncomfortable to seriously examine our TV watching patterns, our internet browsing, our social media use, our shopping, our daydreams. Those are where the world's value system creep in subtly. And it's easy not to notice. we have to be intentional about deciding to be vigilant, because God's wisdom stands diametrically opposed to the world's, and we can't let it sneak in. So we have to start by being pure, separate from the world's values. Next is peaceable. Can I say it correctly? Do I speak Greek?
No.
Thank you. But there is a point. Today there is an important point of going over the Greek. Let's see it. Yeah. This word is essentially peace-loving or promoting peace. Now, we get a little bit hung up on the word peaceable sometimes, because sometimes we get this idea that it means we avoid conflict at all costs. And that's not what this word means. Sometimes being peaceable does mean that you just decide to let something go. Let it roll off your back. Like water off a duck's back. It just rolls and it's gone and it's good. Deciding not to take offense, or even releasing somebody from maybe a small sting that genuinely did hurt, but you just decide to let it roll, is something that we have discussed before. And we should be striving to have that mature mindset that doesn't sweat the small stuff. But, because we don't want to be those petty people who are constantly, oh my gosh, I'm so offended. And you're like, okay, well, okay. It's a miserable, self-centered, immature way to live. And we don't want to be that. We want to grow beyond it. We want to be able to be like, you want to throw me into a lion's den? Okay. But that's what we're striving toward. But we have to live as believers where we are. So if we're genuinely offended by somebody, genuinely offended by something, and they're a brother or sister in Christ, saying, oh, well, I want to be peaceable, so I'm just not going to say anything, and harbor it in my heart forever. Every time I think about it. And then that resentment and bitterness grows. That's not promoting peace. What that's promoting is, again, that bitter heart. So if we are offended by something, there's a right way to go about it. We want to go to that person in love and seek to build them up and say, hey, I care about you, you did this thing, and it hurt me. And for serious conflicts, we got to be willing to be humble. Because usually if there's a serious conflict, we like to think that we didn't do anything wrong, right? It was all the other person. But if you can get to at least 1% our fault, there's probably another 34, 64% hiding behind the corner of our mind that we're not quite yet willing to acknowledge. So it takes humility to be able to really look at ourselves and say, what could I have done better? And then to own that. Now, God's word says that if somebody's done something against you, or whatever, if you realize that there's a problem, go ahead and take care of it. Whether you think it's all them, you think it's all you, doesn't matter. Go take care of it in a spirit of love and kindness. And we know this. It's in our head. We know it. We've done it before. And it takes reminding, because it's hard to be peaceable. We want to just be like, you know what? I'm right. And you're wrong, and you're a jerk. And so there. But that's not what God calls us to. He calls us to be peaceable. And if we're interacting with somebody else's situation, it takes a characteristic that we're going to talk about more in a little bit. It takes impartiality. Being willing to step into the situation and not to just take sides right away, not to make assumptions. And that can be hard too, depending on who's involved. But again, that's what God calls us to. It's not necessarily that in every situation God calls us to just sit back and, well, I'm not going to say anything because I want to promote peace. Sometimes it takes standing for truth or calling somebody out for something. But why are we doing it? How are we doing it? What's our goal? Is to promote peace. We're seeking to aim at a resolution. And the next aspect is being gentle. Now, this one I did practice as well, but I can't do because there are too many vowels in a row and I just can't. So it means being gracious and forbearing, being gentle. When we correct somebody, be it a kid or grandkid, coworker, a subordinate, a neighbor's kid, youth group hooligans running through the hall, do they genuinely fear for their lives as your wrath descends upon them? Or do they know that they're in the presence of a safe rebuke, a helpful redirection. Whenever you interact with an EGR, extra grace required individual, are you snappy, exacting, or do we extend patient grace? One of the most tragic things that I see when I'm subbing, something that makes me sad whenever I see it, is whenever teachers or aides have, like, they're working with the special needs kid and they're so impatient and harsh. Why are you doing that? Put it down. It breaks my heart. But on the other hand, whenever those teachers or aides, I know a few of them, it doesn't matter what that kid does. It doesn't matter how many times he reaches over and pushes that button. They say, no, you can't push that button. The constant, patient kindness. Oh, it makes me want to cry every time I'm like, God bless you. Just God bless you. Now, those two groups of people, they're doing the same thing, right? They're working with people who don't quite know what they're doing, and they're doing their best, but in the world's eyes, their best isn't a lot. So what divides those two groups? What allows the one group to be gentle? Well, they understand what their job is, and they understand what the needs of those people are, and they've decided that whatever they're feeling, their needs, their desires, even their feelings, they don't matter so much. That they're being called to minister to this person, and they do it well. So are we gentle in our interactions with others? Next, being open to reason. This word means being willing to hear and to respond appropriately. Now, some of your translations may have the word reasonable. I think open to reason is a better translation, because it's not just that you're currently reasoning correctly, but that you are willing to be reasoned with. You're willing to hear another side. You're willing to listen. When we're in an argument, do we stubbornly clamp down on our opinion and refuse to hear anybody else, or are we open? Now, sometimes this may take picturing ourselves in a variety of contexts, because sometimes we may be perfectly open to reason, and sometimes in a situation that we may care about more or know more about, we may be a little bit more, if you know what I mean, with your husband, with your kids.
Were you listening to my conversation over here? You were listening to my
I was not.
conversation.
This is written down. I am reading word for word. Miss Vanessa. Almost, not quite word for word. With your kids. Certain theological discussions. Perhaps you're in a clothing store disputing a posted sales price. Maybe it's during a Sam luncheon and you're disputing the best way to serve applesauce. Or perhaps
That's why I don't go to Sam luncheon.
a ladies' ministry meeting. How do we reach the younger generation? On social media during a political conversation. I heard some intakes of breath, those harsh intakes. They're the best. Now, sometimes I find myself becoming more resolved in a position simply because somebody else challenged it. Not because I'm particularly passionate, but simply because somebody had the audacity to challenge me. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Now I'm never letting go of this position just because you said something. Now, is that prideful resolve a good thing? No. No, that is worldly wisdom. That's not God's wisdom. And so, in your life, in those interactions, where are you displaying God's wisdom? And where are you producing disorder? Next phrase. It's a 2-for-1. Full of mercy and good fruits. Now, in Greek, it really is prepositional phrase and then mercy and good fruit. So these two things are linked together. You can't talk about mercy separated from good fruit. So we're going to talk about the two things, but then we're going to put them together. So first of all, we have mercy. Elios, kindness or goodwill, plus a desire to help. So whenever we have mercy, it's going to be the inward feeling of kindness towards somebody who is afflicted, suffering in some way. And it's not just, oh, that's so sad. But it's something beyond that, something that prompts you to want to do something. But it doesn't stop there, because otherwise we would just have, again, mercy. But we also have good fruit. Now the word good means good. Now the word fruits in Greek is karpos, and in English it means fruits. That was probably the easiest one that I've ever done. So, karpos is fruit, but does it mean literal fruit that I go and pick off a tree? No, that's got it. Nope. This is another figure of speech. So, if we're thinking about figure of speech, this is a metaphor. He's trying to point to something. There's not a direct word for word. This is like this. So, what is he talking about? Well, fruit is this sort of after effect of a tree's growth. It's the product of what is going on with the tree. And so, what James is trying to emphasize here is we shouldn't just have kind feelings in our heart. Again, this harks back again to James chapter 2. It's not enough to just say, oh, go and be well. You gotta do something. Have fruit. And fruit is works. So, in our lives, are we motivated to reach out into our communities, our families, our church, to see the needs, to be moved by them, and to do something? In our day and age, we're overwhelmed day in and day out with information. Our news cycle seems to move every 30 minutes. It's like one moment we're talking about Afghanistan, and the next moment we're talking about Kanye, and the next moment we're talking about Liberia. And I'm like, I'm sorry, didn't we just have a really bad thing happen in Afghanistan? And we're already 6 news cycles beyond in the next, again, it seems like 24 hours and it's already gone. And with the advent of the internet, we're not just concerned about our local happenings. We get to hear everything from everywhere. Small news, medium news, big news, the most tragic things that make it on. And it's easy to become desensitized. You just say, oh, that's so sad, scroll. Scroll. Just keep going on. It's easier whenever something happens close to home. But even there, we can develop such an insensitivity that we're saying, oh, I'm so sorry for their loss. Scroll. Because that's what's happened in our culture. And so this is what James is addressing. Do we develop that tender heart? That, now, I'm not saying every single news story do we need to go and create a GoFundMe, because we're not called to do that for everything. But do we see the sorrow in people's lives, the needs? Are we moved? And whenever we are, is our response oriented around helping them? Or is it around garnering some attention for ourselves? You know, a little share on social media. This is so sad. Whenever I saw this, I just cried for a week straight, and it just moved my heart so much, and I've just been praying, and Lord, and it starts to develop into something that's about me. Awkwardly, in the midst of tragedy, I've managed to sort of twist it into making people think, oh, well, I'm such a kind and compassionate person, I care so much, I haven't actually done anything, but look at me, right? It's a temptation. James wouldn't write it if it wasn't a temptation, right? Now, maybe for you, you're like, well, I don't struggle with this particular one, but this is what James is talking about. God's wisdom will prompt both a compassionate heart and compassionate deeds. Now, our next word, I can't do it. Fritos. We're talking about Fritos now. Is free from prejudice, impartial. Now, we mentioned this when we were talking about peaceable. When we're impartial, we're not showing favoritism or being improperly influenced in a decision we're making. And this harks back to James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, again talking about partiality. James really is doing a super duper recap in this section in case you didn't notice. Now, you may feel like you're all right on this one. You're like, oh, I'm not like in the Supreme Court. Whenever I'm on a jury, I do my best, and that's pretty much all I had to do. But consider, have we ever shaded what we've said so that we came out looking just a little bit better? A little bit. You know, sorry I'm late, there was some traffic. Well, there was traffic. But I also left 10 minutes late because I took too long brushing my hair and whatever. Got distracted on Facebook is actually what happened. But the traffic was really bad. Have you ever reconstructed a conversation so that someone you love didn't get in quite as much trouble as they might have if you just stated facts? Have you ever, in a conversation, allowed a little bit of emotion, a little bit, to make the other lady in the grocery store seem like such a jerk and you were, again, completely innocent? Have you ever painted somebody of the opposing political party as nigh unto the devil incarnate? None of us are above being prejudiced, but God's wisdom is perfectly fair, and it shows itself in even-handedness, impartiality. The next word is sincere. I can do this one. Anipokritos. I don't know why this one stuck, but this one did. So this word means genuine, without hypocrisy. This word means that you don't act nice with somebody whenever you're serving right next to them, and then start gossiping about them when they leave the room. We don't manipulate people for our own purposes, presenting some sort of kind exterior or a sob story that's intended to get them to help you or to feel bad for you. Say, oh, shoot, the poor thing. Again, it's not the things themselves, but why we're doing it. God's wisdom causes us to shoot straight with people, telling the truth, and reaching out in an earnest love that doesn't have an ulterior motive. So all of these characteristics showcase skillful living in God's eyes. When we're rightly fearing the Lord, our lives will look like this, starting with purity and working on down the list. Now, in verse 18, James leads to the ultimate goal, which is righteousness. And I didn't practice this one for some reason, so there it is on the screen. You can look at it. Now, righteousness means the state of being as you ought to be. It's being acceptable to God. It's not some crazy word. It's just how things ought to be, how we ought to be, how we were intended to be, right before God. Now, back in James 1:18 through 20, James talked about how we as believers need to be quick to hear God's word. Why? So that we can become righteous. His intended goal at that point, again, laying out the thesis for the book, is that faith that's lived out will lead to righteousness. And so, in this current set of verses, he's detailing the application process, how to live skillfully, how to be wise, hence the list of character traits. Now, James is adding an important qualifier to the heart of the believer. He talks about a harvest, talks about peace. Now, we have a figure of speech right off the bat. We have this aspect of a harvest, and there are two things going on here. We have the fact of the harvest itself. So we know what a harvest is. Whenever you gather the crops in, it's probably talking about grain or barley, because that's what they would have had in mind at that time. Then we have the fact that the harvest has to be sown before it can become a harvest. So we have the actual thing that's being reaped, and then we have the sower, the one who's casting on the ground. And so the harvest here is the righteousness, what's being reaped in peace. And the sower is the person who is striving for peace. And so to get to the goal of righteousness, we have to have a certain goal. We have to have a certain mindset. We have to be stoic. Now, I have a bit of an example here. Like, Mariah, what in the world is on the screen? So, you can't just flounder around, live our lives as Christians, and just sort of meander from church meeting to church meeting and expect that naturally we're just going to produce righteousness in our lives. Again, our eyes have to be on the prize. One of the harder moves that I teach for rock climbing is a dyno, or dynamic move. Essentially just jumping. We're jumping, okay? Now, one mistake that kids often make whenever they're trying to make a dyno is where their eyes go. They're not looking where they need to go. They're looking at the wall in front of them, they close their eyes, they're looking at the ground, they're looking at their feet, but they're not looking at where they need to go. Now I'm going to show you a brief example of whenever you do have your eyes on the goal. And I'm on the wrong side. I need to move. Sorry. And there we go. You land solidly. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So that's whenever you have the eyes on the prize, you're able to attain your goal. And the same thing is true for us. Whenever we have our mindset in the right spot, whenever we are aiming for peace, that's whenever the righteousness, the crop, comes. Let's return to that harvest image. One commentator says, people who cater to selfish ambition need never expect to develop any fruit which is godly, righteous, or helpful to others. False wisdom promotes self-assertion and independence. It destroys a spirit of mutual concern, where Christians do their own thing instead of caring for one another. A community of support and mercy will disintegrate. And so, the question becomes, what kind of soil are you sowing in? What are you aiming for? A mindset that's aimed at peace and righteousness exists in direct contradiction with the worldly wisdom's mindsets of envy and selfish ambition. The two can't coexist. The one mindset will push the other out. And so the choice is ours. Pursue peace, or we'll find that our lives are beset by selfishness and strife. Now, in the next several weeks from now, we're going to find that these verses provide a very smooth transition into the next section, which will be all about peace versus division and strife. For now, though, what James is saying is that if we're living skillfully with the fear of the Lord in place, living wisely, we're aiming for peace, that we'll be the ones to reap righteousness. Now, before we close with our big picture, we have to pause and look to see what James does with the language in these last couple of verses. Now, I have over here the Greek, and then I have the English, and I'd like for you to point out the major differences in what you see. I'm just kidding, because not only do I speak Greek, but you don't speak Greek. So I have a color-coded version. Let's take a look at that instead. Now I have highlighted the words that rhyme. It's not just a section. In English, you can't see it. But in Greek, this is poetry. Not only making it easier for the believers to remember, but in fact, it's beautiful. I wish I could speak Greek so that you could hear what it sounds like, because it is poetry, and it is beautiful. And it's a little picture of what God's wisdom really is. It's beautiful. And when it's lived out in our lives are beautiful. I had to point out. I was like, this is so cool, my gosh. So, big picture. Mariah can jump and land on the rock wall. So, there are two types of wisdom that are available to us as believers. One is demonic, and it's characterized by that self-centered, bitter, envious ambition. And the other is from God. It's characterized by other-centered, peace-promoting practices. To grow righteousness, we have to aim for peace. And as we walk away from this section, think about what our lives are characterized by. Do people look at us and think, she's striving for peace? Or do people generally regard us as bossy, the drama queen, petty, generally hard to get along with? Which wisdom are you living by? With that in mind, that's why I'm like, oh, there's a separate slide. It's fine. This is why. I'm like, why is that slide there twice? So I added something. Whatever. With that in mind, for the next few weeks, take at least one characteristic of true wisdom that you most need to work on. And perhaps, if something doesn't jump out right away, just pray through the list. Say, Spirit, what do you want me to work on? How do you want me to pursue your wisdom? And then list 2 things that can help you grow in that area. Not just this week, and not just next week, but for the next few weeks, because we are not formally meeting. Don't look at me like that. I'm getting it. We are not formally meeting for Bible study for next week, the 21st, or the following week, the 28th. Now, not next week, because nobody's meeting next week, but the following week, the 28th, we are going to have a Christmas-ish gathering. Christmas time. It's still, look, Christmas goes until Epiphany, so we're having a Christmas gathering.
Christmas with you all through the year at the Jim Sesame Street.
We're having Christmas every week at Bible study because Christmas everywhere. So, we're going to have a little gathering. If you would like to bring something, just maybe shoot me an email, say, hey, I'm going to bring this, so that we don't have 50 people all bringing their favorite appetizer of buffalo chicken dip. Although if 50 people do bring buffalo chicken dip, I won't complain. So maybe don't even, no, I'm kidding. But we are going to be doing, we're not trying to creep on your territory, no, I promise. We're doing an escape room that we created for Noah's LBC event with the Chosen. So it's a Chosen themed escape room. It's pretty fun. I liked it. So it's not like this huge thing, but it's fun. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna have a little bit of food. We're just gonna have some fun. Maybe sing a couple songs. Got to sing a couple songs. It's Christmas time. Then we will have our formal next meeting on January 4th. At which time this lesson will be due. We're going to be looking over lesson 11. We'll be in chapter 4 on January 4th. Diabolical division. Do you like that alliteration? I like that alliteration. Pages 61 through 67. Did I miss anything?
I think we're preaching to the choir, but there are a few ladies sign-ups coming up here at the ladies' retreat. And
The missions trip.
the missions trip, yes.
So I don't have details on those, but
They're
here.
both
People are
in
here.
January, yeah.
People are here. We have the website. There's Facebook. Find your resources, people, online, and also be here. So that's it for our lesson time. I'm gonna wave goodbye to the camera. Goodbye, camera. Now move down.